There is nothing more pathetic than parents who bankrupt their future to enable a grown child's delusions. They call it love, but I call it fraud. I'm Stephanie Taylor. For years, I was the invisible daughter, the one who followed the rules, while my brother, the golden boy, drained them dry. When they finally came to me for a bailout, expecting the usual dutiful silence, I didn't write a check. I audited their lives. And when you look at the numbers, there is nowhere to hide the ugliness. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. It all began on a humid afternoon in May, standing on a podium that felt more like an island. The polyester of my graduation gown trapped the late May heat against my skin, turning the ceremony into an endurance test, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. I stood on the podium, clutching the leather-bound diploma that represented 4 years of sleepless nights, missed parties, and relentless discipline. The dean was shaking my hand, his mouth moving in a congratulatory rhythm, but the sound was drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears. I wasn't looking at him. I was scanning the crowd. Row G, seats 12 and 13. I had reserved them 3 months ago. I had sent the tickets via certified mail. I had reminded my mother on Tuesday and my father on Thursday. But as I looked out into the sea of proud parents holding up smartphones and waving bouquets of flowers, seats 12 and 13 were empty. They looked like missing teeth in a perfect smile. I accepted the handshake, forced a grimace that passed for a smile, and walked off the stage. I didn't stop until I reached the privacy of a bathroom stall in the Arts and Sciences building. That was when my phone buzzed against my thigh. I pulled it out, hoping for an emergency. A flat tire on the interstate, a sudden flu. Anything that would provide a logical, forgivable variable for the equation of their absence. Instead, I saw a photo. The resolution was crystal clear, capturing the vivid azure of the Caribbean Ocean in the background. In the foreground, my parents were clinking flute glasses of champagne with my older brother Justin. They were all wearing oversized sunglasses and linen shirts, the uniform of the carelessly wealthy. Justin was grinning, his arm draped loosely over my mother's shoulders, looking every bit the golden prince holding court. Below the image was a text from Mom. Justin really needed a mental health break after the breakup. We got a last-minute deal on the cruise. We'll celebrate your paper when we get back. Love you. It wasn't a paper. It was a degree in accounting with a minor in criminal justice, graduating magna cum laude. But that detail, like so many others in my life, had been filed away by my family as irrelevant. I stared at the screen until the backlight timed out, leaving me in darkness. That was the moment the emotional ledger finally balanced. I realized that to them, I wasn't an investment. I was an overhead cost. Justin, with his failed startups, his dramatic relationships, and his perpetual unemployment, was the asset they couldn't stop pouring capital into. I walked out of that bathroom, deleted the text, and went to my graduation dinner alone at a diner off campus. I ordered a club sandwich, paid the check, and promised myself that I would never again look for a return on an investment that was clearly bankrupt. 5 years later, that cold analytical distance had become my armor and my profession. I sat in my office in downtown Chicago, the hum of the server room acting as white noise, while I dissected the finances of a mid-sized logistics firm suspected of embezzlement. My title was forensic accountant. My job, simply put, was to find the truth buried in the numbers. People lie. They lie to their spouses, they lie to the IRS, and they lie to themselves. But numbers are incapable of deceit. If a dollar enters a system, it must exit or remain. If it vanishes, there is always a trapdoor, and I was the best in the city at finding the latch. My life was streamlined, efficient, and solitary. I had a condo paid for with the bonuses from busting 3 major corporate fraud schemes. I had a wardrobe of sharp, tailored suits that acted as camouflage for a woman who felt too much and showed too little. I spoke to my parents on holidays and birthdays, conversations that were brief, pleasant, and entirely surface level. They knew I was doing well with the math stuff, but they never asked for details. I preferred it that way. Distance was safety. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the variable I hadn't accounted for disrupted my spreadsheet. My personal cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed Mom. It was 2:00 p.m. She never called during work hours unless it was a catastrophe. I let it ring 3 times, finishing a row of data entry before sliding the green icon. I didn't say hello. I waited. Stephanie, oh, thank goodness you picked up. Her voice was breathless, pitched an octave higher than normal. That was her ask voice. I felt my spine stiffen, my professional persona sliding into place like a deadbolt. Hello, Mom. Is everything okay? Is Dad all right? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Oh, Dad is fine. Well, his back is acting up and the stress isn't helping, but he's fine, she rambled, laying the groundwork. It's just, we're in a bit of a bind, honey, a temporary cash flow issue. I swiveled my chair away from the monitors and looked out at the rain streaking the glass. What kind of bind? I asked. I knew the answer before she gave it. The answer was always Justin. It's your brother. She sighed as if Justin were a natural disaster they had no control over rather than a 35-year-old man they refused to stop enabling. He has this incredible opportunity, Stephanie, a consulting firm. He's got clients lined up, big names, but he needs a bridge loan to secure the office space and the server infrastructure. The banks are being difficult. They don't understand his vision. I closed my eyes. The banks understood his credit score, which I assumed was lower than the temperature outside. How much, Mom? I asked, cutting through the fluff. There was a pause, a hesitation that told me the number was significant. 50,000, she whispered. Just for 6 months. We'd give it to him ourselves, obviously, but our liquidity is a little tied up in the market right now, and with the house repairs. We just thought, since you're doing so well and family helps family. Family helps family. The phrase was a weapon sharp and rusted from overuse. I remembered the graduation. I remembered the cruise. I remembered the years of neglect while Justin was bailed out of DUIs, bad leases, and gambling debts. My instinct was to hang up. My secondary instinct was to scream. But I did neither. I was a forensic accountant. I didn't react. I investigated. A request for $50,000 wasn't just a loan, it was a data point. If my parents, who had worked steady government jobs for 40 years, didn't have $50,000 in liquidity, something was wrong. And if Justin needed server infrastructure for a consulting gig, he was lying. The inconsistencies flared in my mind like red flags on a tax return. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch until my mother started to stammer apologies. I know it's a lot, Steph, I know, but I cut her off, my voice smooth and devoid of warmth. I am willing to consider it. The silence on the other end was stunned. She had expected a fight. You are, she asked, hope leaking into her voice. I said, leaning back in my chair, staring at the reflection of a woman who was done being a victim. But this is a business transaction, Mom. 50,000 is a significant investment. I don't lend money on vision. I lend on viability. I paused, letting the terms sink in. I will come down this weekend. I will bring my laptop. I need to see a full business plan, Justin's projected P&L, and because I'm acting as the investor, I need to audit the current family financials to ensure you aren't over-leveraging yourselves to co-sign for him. An audit? She sounded confused, slightly offended. Stephanie, it's just us. It's your brother. Exactly, I said, cold as ice. And if his business is legitimate, he has nothing to hide. Those are my terms. I audit the books, or the checkbook stays closed. I didn't wait for her to agree. I knew they were desperate. I could hear the desperation in the silence. I was going home not as a daughter, but as an auditor. And I had a feeling the books were going to tell me a story they had been trying to hide for years. The drive to my childhood home in the suburbs usually felt like a regression, a physical rewinding of the clock to a time when I was voiceless. But this time, the silence in my rental car felt like the calm before a controlled demolition. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching on gravel that hadn't been raked in years. The house, a colonial structure that my parents used to prune and paint with religious fervor, looked like a tired old man who had stopped shaving. A shutter on the second floor hung askew, the white paint peeling to reveal the gray wood beneath, and the gutters were choked with the decomposition of last autumn's leaves. It was the first physical data point in my investigation. Deferred maintenance usually signaled deferred solvency. I grabbed my briefcase, a heavy leather-bound tool of my trade, and stepped out. My mother met me at the door, her smile tight and anxious. She looked thinner than I remembered, her cardigan slightly frayed at the cuffs. My father sat in his armchair in the living room, the television blaring a cable news channel at maximum volume. He waved a hand at me without turning his head, a gesture of dismissal I was intimately familiar with. They offered me tea, they asked about the traffic, but the air in the house was thick with the unspoken desperation of the ask. They needed the $50,000, and they needed it yesterday. I had barely set my laptop on the dining room table, a mahogany piece that used to be covered in lace but was now scarred with water rings, when the rumble of a high-performance engine shook the front window. I looked out to see a sleek charcoal gray sports coupe swerve into the driveway, narrowly missing my rental. It was a vehicle that retailed for more than my parents' combined annual pension. Justin stepped out wearing a suit that was too shiny and sunglasses that were too big. He didn't walk. He strutted, projecting the unearned confidence of a man who had never truly paid for a mistake. He burst through the front door, bringing a gust of expensive cologne with him. "Steph," he boomed, spreading his arms as if we were best friends reuniting after a war. "The big city auditor returns to the humble abode. You look serious." He dropped his keys on the table with a clatter. "Ready to invest in the next big thing?" I didn't smile. I didn't hug him. I simply opened my laptop, the screen glowing with the stark white of a blank spreadsheet. "Sit down, Justin," I said, my voice flat. "I'm not here to invest yet. I'm here to verify." The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. My parents hovered in the doorway to the kitchen, wringing their hands like nervous spectators, while Justin slumped into the chair opposite me, his arrogance flickering for a microsecond before he masked it with a scoff. "Verify? You sound like a cop. It's a consulting firm, Steph. Strategic oversight for mid-cap tech companies. It's high-level stuff. I don't expect you to understand the nuance." He slid a glossy folder across the table. "Here's the pitch deck. Graphics, projections, the whole 9 yards. I didn't touch the folder. "I don't care about the nuance, and I don't care about your projections," I said, locking eyes with him. "Projections are fantasy. I want history. I need your bank statements for the last 24 months, your business registration documents, your client contracts, and your tax returns." Justin laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "Tax returns. The business is new. We're in the growth phase. We haven't filed yet." "Then personal tax returns," I countered. "And personal bank statements. If you want me to float you 50 grand, I need to know you aren't bleeding cash elsewhere." Justin slammed his hand on the table enough to make the china in the cabinet rattle. "This is ridiculous. Mom, Dad, are you seeing this? She's treating me like a criminal. I'm her brother." My mother rushed forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was heavy with the weight of decades of enabling. "Stephanie, please," she whispered. "Why do you have to be so harsh? He's trying so hard. Can't you just trust him? We trust him." I looked up at her, seeing the fear behind her eyes. It wasn't trust. It was a desperate hope that if they just gave him enough, he would finally become the man they pretended he was. "Trust is not a line item, Mom," I said, removing her hand from my shoulder. "If you want the check, I see the books. That is the non-negotiable condition." The standoff lasted for a full minute. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating until the reality of their poverty outweighed Justin's pride. He cursed under his breath, pulled out his phone, and began forwarding PDF files to my email. "Fine," he spat. "Read them. Bore yourself to death. But you'll see. I'm building an empire." I ignored his commentary and began the download. For the next 3 hours, the dining room was silent, except for the clicking of my keyboard and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My parents retreated to the living room, whispering in hushed tones, while Justin paced the kitchen drinking my father's beer. I entered the zone. This was where I lived in the architecture of transactions. I started with Justin's accounts. The business account was a joke. It had been opened 6 months ago with a deposit of $10,000. The source of the deposit was a transfer from mom and dad joint checking. Since then, there were 0 deposits from clients, 0 revenue. The outflows, however, were a torrent of lifestyle maintenance: $500 at a steakhouse, $2,000 at an electronics store, lease payments for the sports car, a consulting trip to Vegas that coincided with a UFC fight weekend. It was a shell, a classic facade used to justify unemployment as entrepreneurship. But as bad as Justin's spending was, it didn't account for the sheer volume of money that had moved through his hands over the last few years. The $50,000 he was asking for was a drop in the bucket compared to the lifestyle he was leading. I needed to see the source. "Mom," I called out, my voice cutting through the house. "I need your login information for the main bank accounts and the retirement portfolios." She hesitated, standing in the doorway. "Is that necessary?" "We just wanted you to look at Justin's business." "It's necessary," I said, not looking up from the screen. "I need to assess your liquidity to see if you can afford to co-sign the lease he wants. If I give him the money and he defaults, the landlord comes after you. I need to protect you." It was a half-truth. I was protecting them, but not in the way they thought. Reluctantly, she wrote down the passwords on a scrap of paper. I logged in. What I saw made my stomach drop. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. I had expected them to be dipping into savings. I hadn't expected them to be drowning. The primary savings account, which I knew had held over $100,000 when I graduated, was effectively empty. Balance $1, $402. The transaction history was a bloody trail of transfers to Justin labeled gift, help, rent, and investment. But that was just the surface wound. I clicked over to the retirement accounts. My father's 401k, the nest egg he had built over 40 years of shift work, had been ravaged. There were penalty withdrawals, huge taxable chunks taken out early dating back 3 years. The balance was down to 20% of what it should have been. Then I found the home equity line of credit HELOC. They had refinanced the house 2 years ago, the house that was supposed to be paid off. They had pulled out nearly all the equity. Where did it go? I cross-referenced the dates. A massive transfer out of the HELOC coincided with a deposit into a generic LLC account I didn't recognize. I dug deeper into the LLC. It was registered to Justin. The memo line on the bank transfer read, "Consulting Initial Capital." That was the business he had started 2 years ago, the one that failed silently before this new consulting firm idea. He had burned through their home equity on a venture that never even launched, likely spending it on the same luxury facade he was displaying today. I sat back in the chair, the cold light of the laptop illuminating the disaster. The forensic picture was clear. Justin wasn't just a mooch. He was a predator. He had systematically groomed our parents using emotional manipulation and their desperate desire for him to succeed to strip mine their financial future. He had used the pressure of his failures, the opportunity of their blind trust, and the rationalization that he was just one big break away from paying them back. It was the classic fraud triangle played out in the living room of the people who raised me. My parents weren't just experiencing a cash flow issue. They were technically insolvent. If the furnace broke tomorrow, they couldn't fix it. If one of them needed long-term care, they would be wards of the state. I looked up. Justin was in the kitchen laughing at something on his phone, oblivious to the fact that I had just autopsied his life. My mother was watching me, her face pale, waiting for me to write a check that would fix everything. She had no idea she was already ruined. The anger that had been simmering in my gut since graduation day cooled into something harder, something sharper. It wasn't resentment anymore. It was duty. They had called me to save Justin's business. Instead, I realized I had to save them from their son. The audit was over. The execution was about to begin. I closed the laptop with a definitive snap. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. In my line of work, emotional outbursts are considered variables that compromise the integrity of the data. Instead, I calmly unzipped the side pocket of my briefcase and retrieved a 6-foot HDMI cable. I walked into the living room where the television was still blaring a pharmaceutical commercial and silenced it. My father looked up, blinking in confusion, his mouth half open. "Stephanie, what are you doing?" he asked, shifting uncomfortably in his recliner. "We need to have a meeting," I said, my voice steady and authoritative. "A shareholder meeting." I plugged the cable into the side of the TV and connected it to my laptop. The screen flickered for a moment before mirroring my display. The spreadsheet I had spent the last 3 hours compiling a document I had mentally titled "The Autopsy of the Taylor Family Estate" was now projected in high definition 60 inches wide. The rows of red text seemed to glow against the beige wallpaper. "Justin!" I called out, not raising my voice, but projecting it with enough force to cut through the kitchen wall. "Get in here, now!" My brother strolled in, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand and a smirk on his face. "What's with the PowerPoint, Steph? You going to lecture us on coupon clipping?" He dropped onto the sofa next to Mom, draping his arm over the back cushion, visibly relaxed. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already been mined. I stood by the TV, acting as the presenter of their ruin. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is not a lecture. It is a reality check. You asked for $50,000. I told you I needed to assess the viability of the investment. The assessment is complete." I clicked a cell on the spreadsheet. It highlighted a row labeled Graduation Cruise, 2020. "Let's start here," I said. "The cruise you took while I was walking across the stage. Do you remember how you paid for it?" My mother shifted, smoothing her skirt. We used savings, I think. It was a special occasion." "Incorrect," I stated. "You didn't have the savings. I traced the transaction. You made a hardship withdrawal from Dad's healthcare annuity. You paid a 10% penalty plus income tax on that money. That 10-day trip didn't cost $5,000. After the penalties and lost compound interest over the last 5 years, that trip cost you $22,000 of your future medical care." The room went silent. My father squinted at the screen. That can't be right," he muttered. "The financial advisor said—" "You didn't speak to an advisor, Dad," I corrected him. "You spoke to Justin. He handled the paperwork." "Isn't that right, Justin?" Justin sat up straighter, the smirk vanishing. "I handled it because they don't understand the forms. I got them the cash they needed for a mental health break. You're spinning this to make me look bad." I ignored him and scrolled down. The screen was a waterfall of red ink. "Here." I pointed to a cluster of transactions from 2023. "The refinancing of the house. You pulled out $80,000 of equity. Mom, you told me that was for roof repairs and foundation work. Yet I see no payments to contractors. I see a single wire transfer to JT Ventures LLC." I looked at Justin. "That's you. What did you do with $80,000, Justin? Because there is no business." "It was seed capital," Justin shouted, standing up now. His face was flushing a blotchy red. "Startups fail, Stephanie. It's part of the process. You think you're so smart with your steady paycheck and your boring life, but you don't have the guts to build something." He turned to our parents, his voice shifting into a practiced whine. "She's jealous. She's always been jealous that you guys actually like hanging out with me. She's trying to humiliate us." My mother looked between us, tears welling in her eyes. "Stephanie, please turn it off. We understand. Money is tight. We just wanted to help him." "You aren't helping him," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "You are cannibalizing yourselves to feed him. Look at the bottom line." I highlighted the final cell. It was bold red and negative. $214,000. "You aren't just broke. You are insolvent. You have less than 6 months of runway before you start defaulting on the mortgage payments for the house you've lived in for 30 years. If Dad has another heart episode, you will be on Medicaid in a state facility because there is nothing left to pay for private care. Justin has eaten it all. The silence that followed was absolute. My father looked pale, his hand clutching the armrest of his chair, as if he were in physical pain. The reality was sinking in. The golden child hadn't just been borrowing, he had been looting. But Justin wasn't done. He was cornered, and like any narcissist, he doubled down on aggression. "You don't know what you're talking about," he yelled, stepping toward me. "This is my house too. I'm on the deed for the guest cottage. You can't come in here and dictate terms." "Actually," I said, not flinching as he advanced, "I can, and I have." I minimized the spreadsheet and opened a web browser. On the screen was the dashboard for the bank that held their primary assets. The status bar at the top was flashing a bright, unmistakable orange "account status frozen. Fraud alert active." "What did you do?" Justin whispered, staring at the screen. "I didn't just audit the books, Justin. I flagged them," I said, turning my gaze to my parents. 3 years ago, before Dad's hip surgery, you both signed a durable power of attorney document. You appointed me as your agent in the event of incapacitation, and this is the specific clause I invoked 10 minutes ago, financial exploitation posing an immediate threat to the principal's estate. I pulled a folded copy of the document from my pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. I just got off the phone with the bank's fraud department while I was in the dining room. I sent them the evidence of the coercion, the unauthorized transfers, and the elder abuse. "Abuse?" my mother gasped, clutching her chest. "Stephanie, no. He's your brother." "He is a parasite," I said. "And I have legally cauterized the wound. As of this moment, all assets are frozen pending a full forensic investigation. The credit cards are dead. The checking accounts are locked. The HELOC is suspended. No one spends a dime without my countersignature. No one." Justin laughed, a desperate, incredulous sound. "You're bluffing. You can't just lock me out of my own money." "It's not your money," I said. "It never was." "Watch me," Justin sneered. He pulled out his wallet and grabbed his sleek black credit card, an authorized user card on my father's account, with a $20,000 limit. He pulled up an app on his phone, likely a crypto exchange or a gambling site he used to move cash quickly. He tapped the screen furiously. "I'm transferring $5,000 right now just to spite you. Watch." He hit the button. He waited. A second passed. Then two. A sharp ding echoed from his phone. He stared at the screen. The color drained from his face. He tapped it again. Ding. "Transaction declined," I recited without needing to see the screen. "Contact issuer for details." You bitch," he snarled, looking up at me with pure hatred. "Undo it. Undo it right now. I have payments pending." "My car lease is due tomorrow." "Then I guess you're walking," I replied. "The lease is in your name, Justin. But the money source was Dad. That tap is dry. You have $0, you have zero credit. And since you're living here rent-free, you currently have zero claim to tenancy if the conservatorship decides you're a liability to the homeowners." My father finally spoke. His voice was trembling, a mix of fear and a dawning terrible realization. "Stephanie, surely there's a mistake. We can't just cut him off. He needs to eat." "There is food in the fridge," I said, gesturing to the kitchen. "He can eat a sandwich." But the days of sushi dinners and bottle service are over. I have appointed myself as the fiduciary guardian of this estate. I am going to sell the car to recoup some of the losses. I am going to restructure the debt. And Justin, I turned to him, you are going to get a job, a real one, because the bank of Mom and Dad is permanently closed. Justin threw his phone onto the couch. It bounced and hit the floor. He looked at our parents, waiting for them to save him, to tell me to stop, to override my authority. My mother looked at the spreadsheet still glowing on the TV, the red numbers burning into her retinas. She looked at the total debt. She looked at my father, who was gray and gasping slightly for air. For the first time in her life, She didn't move to comfort Justin. She sank back into the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "Fix it, Steph," my father whispered, his eyes closed. "Just fix it." "I am," I said. "This is what fixing it looks like." Justin stood there, vibrating with impotent rage. He reached for his wallet again, then realized it was useless. He looked around the room, the trap closing in on him. The air was thick with the ozone smell of a storm that had finally broken. He opened his mouth to scream, to threaten, to beg, but the cold, analytical weight of the frozen accounts crushed the words in his throat. He was checkmated, and he knew it. The silence following my declaration of total financial lockdown was shattered not by a scream, but by a sound far more terrifying. The wet, ragged gasp of a man whose body could no longer process the stress of his reality. My father, who had spent the last hour shrinking into his armchair as the red numbers on the television screen dismantled his ego, suddenly gripped his chest. His face, previously ash-gray, flushed a deep, alarming violet. He didn't clutch his arm like they do in the movies. He clawed at his collar, his eyes rolling back as his breathing turned into a desperate, rhythmic wheeze. My mother screamed a high-pitched, helpless sound that seemed to paralyze her. Justin stood frozen, his phone still in his hand, looking at Dad with an expression that wasn't concern, but annoyance, as if a medical emergency were just another inconvenience, interrupting his attempts to unlock his credit card. I didn't freeze. I checked the time, 4:17 p.m., and pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed 911, my voice steady as I relayed the address and the symptoms. Male 68, conscious but disoriented, hypertensive crisis, possible myocardial infarction. I hung up and moved to him, loosening his tie, checking his pulse. It was thready and racing. "Justin," I snapped, not looking up. "Go to the end of the driveway and flag the ambulance." He blinked, looking down at me. "But the account, Stephanie. If he goes to the hospital, how do I get gas? How do I—" "Go!" I roared a command so guttural and furious it finally pierced his narcissism. He scrambled out the door. The next 2 hours were a blur of siren wails, flashing lights, and the antiseptic smell of the county hospital. I rode in the front of the ambulance. Mom rode in the back, sobbing and holding Dad's hand. Justin followed in his leased sports car, likely burning the last vapors of fuel in his tank. When we arrived at the emergency department, the chaos of triage took over. Dad was wheeled behind double-swinging doors, hooked up to monitors that beeped in a frantic tempo. Mom was directed to the waiting room, a purgatory of gray chairs and vending machines. I stood by the intake desk handling the paperwork because, of course, I was the only one who had thought to grab Dad's insurance card and ID from his wallet before the paramedics loaded him up. I handed the clipboard back to the intake nurse and walked to the waiting area. Justin was already there, pacing back and forth, hounding Mom. "You have to tell them to let me in," Justin was saying, his voice rising in panic. "I need to talk to him before they sedate him or whatever. He needs to call the bank. Mom, listen to me, my car is on empty. I can't even get home." My mother looked small, huddled in her coat, her eyes red-rimmed. "Justin, please, your father is... his heart." I know," Justin interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "But this is an emergency too. Stephanie locked everything. I have $0. I need him to authorize a transfer." I watched the scene from 10 feet away, a cold fury rising in my chest. Even here, with his father potentially dying from the stress he caused, Justin saw Dad only as a malfunctioning ATM. I stepped forward to intervene, to physically remove him if necessary, but the universe sent someone else. The double doors to the ER swung open with force. A woman stepped out. She was not a doctor, but she carried an authority that outranked everyone in the building. She was in her 60s, built like a fortress, wearing scrubs that were perfectly pressed, and a name badge that read, "Head Nurse Higgins." Her hair was iron gray and pulled back into a tight bun that suggested nonsense would not be tolerated. She held a clipboard like a shield and scanned the waiting room with eyes that had seen everything from birth to death and was impressed by neither. Her gaze landed on Justin, who was still looming over Mom. "Sir," Mrs. Higgins barked. The single syllable cracked like a whip. Justin jumped, spinning around. "You are disturbing the other families. Sit down or get out." Justin, sensing a challenge to his perceived dominance, puffed up his chest. I'm his son. I need to see him. It's urgent. Mrs. Higgins marched over her rubber-soled shoes, silent on the linoleum. She stopped 12 inches from Justin's face. She didn't look up at him. She looked through him. The patient is stabilizing. His blood pressure is 210 over 130. He needs quiet. He does not need, she gestured to Justin's flashy suit and agitated demeanor, whatever this energy is. Visiting hours are restricted. Immediate family only. One at a time. I am immediate family, Justin spat, and I need to ask him a question about his insurance. It was a lie, and a bad one. Mrs. Higgins narrowed her eyes. She tilted her head, studying him. Then her gaze drifted past him to where Mom was weeping softly, and finally to me. I was standing still, clutching my briefcase, my face composed but pale. Our eyes locked. A flicker of recognition passed over Mrs. Higgins' stern features. Her eyebrows knit together, and she took a slow step toward me. I know you, she said, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a slow, dawning realization. Taylor. Patient Robert Taylor. She looked back at me. 12 years ago. Green stick fracture, left radius. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital air conditioning. I nodded slowly. Yes, I was 16. Mrs. Higgins nodded, the memory slotting into place. I was on triage that night. You came in alone, walked 3 miles from the soccer fields because your parents were in the parking lot arguing with the coach about why your brother didn't make varsity. She turned her head slowly to look at Justin, her expression hardening into something resembling granite. I remember. You sat in chair 4 for 6 hours. You didn't cry. You filled out your own admission forms with your non-dominant hand. And when your parents finally came in, they asked if the cast would be expensive. The memory was a physical blow, but hearing it spoken aloud by a witness, a stranger who had seen the truth of my childhood, was strangely validating. It wasn't just in my head. I hadn't imagined the neglect. It was real enough that a busy ER nurse remembered it a decade later. Mrs. Higgins looked at Justin, then back to me. She saw the dynamic clearly. She saw the predator and the survivor. He's the brother, Mrs. Higgins asked, jerking her chin toward Justin. Yes, I said, and he's the reason the father is in here. She didn't need a medical chart to diagnose the stress in the room. Yes, I replied. Financial stress. Severe. Mrs. Higgins pursed her lips. She turned to Justin. You, she pointed a finger that looked as hard as bone, are a clinical stressor. As the head nurse of this unit, I have the authority to bar any individual deemed a threat to the patient's recovery. You are raising the patient's blood pressure just by existing in this zip code. You can't do that, Justin shouted, attracting the attention of a security guard near the entrance. I have rights. I need to see my dad. You have the right to leave, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Security. She didn't yell, she just signaled. The guard, a large man who looked bored until this moment, stepped forward. Escort this individual off the premises. He is barred from the ward for 24 hours. Justin's eyes went wide. He looked at Mom. Mom, do something. She's kicking me out. I don't have gas money, Mom. My mother looked up, her face streaked with mascara. She looked at Mrs. Higgins, who stood like a sentinel protecting her husband from the very thing she had birthed. Then she looked at Justin. For the first time in years, she didn't reach for her purse. She didn't plead his case. She just shook her head and looked down at her hands. Take him, Mrs. Higgins said to the guard. Justin was guided, shouting and protesting toward the sliding glass doors. This is illegal. You'll hear from my lawyer, Stephanie. You planned this. The doors swooshed shut, cutting off his voice. The silence that followed was heavy and pure. Mrs. Higgins adjusted her clipboard. She turned to my mother. Mrs. Taylor, you can go in for 5 minutes, but no talk of money, no talk of the son. If I see his monitor spike, I'm pulling you out. Mom nodded meekly and hurried through the double doors. Then Mrs. Higgins turned to me. The hardness in her face softened just a fraction. It wasn't a smile, I doubted she did those, but it was a look of professional respect. "You're the one handling the affairs now," she asked. "I am," I said. "I'm the power of attorney. I'm the auditor." "Good," she said. "About time someone looked out for the patient, not the parasite." She checked a watch pinned to her uniform. "I'm on shift for another 8 hours. I'll make sure the rules are followed. No exceptions. He doesn't get back in." "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I hadn't expected to feel. "Thank you for remembering." "I never forget the ones who have to raise themselves," she said. "Go get a coffee. You look like you're preparing for war." "I think the war is over," I said, looking at the empty space where Justin had been standing. "Now it's just the cleanup, Mrs." Higgins nodded once, sharp and efficient, and disappeared back through the swinging doors to guard my parents from their own mistakes. I stood alone in the waiting room, surrounded by the hum of vending machines, feeling the strange, weightless sensation of total control. Justin was out. The assets were frozen. And for the first time, the gatekeeper was on my side. 3 days later, the air in my father's hospital room was no longer filled with the frantic energy of an emergency. Instead, it held the heavy, sterile silence of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. My father was sitting up pale and diminished, picking at a tray of low-sodium hospital food that looked as flavorless as his financial future. My mother sat in the visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the floor. They weren't speaking to each other. The illusion of their happy, successful family unit had been shattered by a forensic accountant with a terrifying spreadsheet, and they were still trying to navigate the debris. I stood at the foot of the bed, not with flowers or balloons, but with a thick plastic-bound binder. I placed it on the adjustable table, the thud echoing slightly in the room. "This," I announced, tapping the cover, "is your new life." My father looked at the binder with something akin to fear. "What is it, Stephanie?" he asked, his voice raspy. "It is the insolvency recovery plan," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I have spent the last 48 hours negotiating with the bank, restructuring the HELOC, and setting up a repayment schedule for the credit card debt. You are not going to lose the house, Dad, but you are effectively employees of your own debt now." I opened the binder to the first page, a pie chart that was almost entirely gray. "This is your budget. It is forensic. It is absolute. I have set up an automated system. Your pension and Social Security checks will deposit directly into a controlled trust account I manage. The mortgage, utilities, and insurance will be paid automatically. What remains, which is exactly $600 a month, will be transferred to a debit card for groceries and gas." "600?" my mother gasped, her eyes widening. "But Stephanie, the grocery bill alone. And what about the club membership? What about Christmas?" "The country club membership was canceled yesterday," I replied, not looking up from the page. "You can't afford it. As for Christmas, you can knit scarves. You are $200,000 in the hole, Mom. You don't have the luxury of giving gifts." I turned the page. "And this brings us to the most important line item, Justin." My mother flinched at the name. "He called me," she whispered. "He said he's staying at a motel on the highway. He sounded broken." "He's staying at the Motel 6 because that's what he can afford with his first paycheck," I corrected. "I pulled some strings with a contact I have in logistics. I got him a job." My father looked up, hopeful. "A consulting job?" "No," I said, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. "A job as a glorious picker at a fulfillment center. Night shift, $12 an hour. He walks 15 miles a shift, picking boxes off shelves. It's honest work. It's steady. And since I flagged his Social Security number for fraud in the banking system, he won't be getting a white-collar job handling anyone's money ever again. He is uninsurable." "He's 35, my mother cried softly. "He has a bad back. He can't do manual labor." "He has a bad back because he spends 12 hours a day gaming in your living room," I countered. "He will adjust, or he won't. But he will never see a single cent of your money again. The trust account is locked. If you try to withdraw cash to give to him, I will know instantly, and I will reduce your allowance to compensate. Do we understand each other?" The harshness of the arrangement hung in the air. It was draconian, yes, but it was the only way to keep a roof over their heads. I was the parent now. They were the unruly teenagers who had maxed out the credit card. My mother looked at me, her eyes wet with tears of frustration and a lingering toxic loyalty. "We did the best we could, Stephanie," she said, her voice trembling with a plea for absolution. "We just wanted everyone to be happy. We tried so hard to be good parents." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. I saw the weakness that she mistook for kindness. I saw the fear of conflict that she mistook for peace. "Your best cost you your retirement," I said, my voice quiet but cutting. "Your best created a narcissist who almost killed Dad. My resentment, the coldness you always complained about, is the only reason you aren't going to be homeless next year. I saved your house. I saved your dignity. You're welcome. I didn't wait for a thank you. I knew it wouldn't come." They were mourning the loss of the fantasy, and I was the one who had turned on the lights. I turned and walked out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind me. The hallway was bright and busy. At the nurse's station, Mrs. Higgins was reviewing charts. She looked up as I approached. We didn't speak. She simply looked at the binder in my hand, then at my face, and gave me a single sharp nod, a gesture of respect from one guardian to another. It was the only validation I needed. I walked out into the parking lot, the automatic doors parting to let in the fresh, cool air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I climbed into my rental car and tossed the briefcase onto the passenger seat. I checked my own bank account on my phone. The numbers were black, robust, and growing. They were mine. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and turned onto the highway leading back to the airport. I wasn't going back to a lonely apartment. I was going back to a life that I had built brick by honest brick. I was debt-free. I was guilt-free. And as the city limits of my childhood faded in the rearview mirror, I realized I was finally, truly free. The audit was closed, the balance was restored, and I never looked back. Stephanie proved that sometimes the most effective form of justice isn't about shouting. It is about simply letting people face the consequences of their own actions. It is a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. What did you think of her decision to freeze the family assets? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.